confirmation as well from Eskom today that the load shedding you had last night will return for another episode tonight from 5 p.m. until early tomorrow morning. And while we hope this period of load shedding will just be a mini-series, there could well be other episodes of load shedding in store for us this weekend. There seem to be huge problems around our electricity system. There are several different solutions being proposed to it. One of them comes from the energy analyst Clyde Mallinson. He's with me now. Clyde, good afternoon to you, and thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, Stephen.
Before we get to your proposed solution, I would imagine that you, I suppose, like me, are expecting more episodes of load shedding, more in the storm to come through the winter months.
Absolutely, I'm afraid. Eskom does most of its planned maintenance during the summer months, and it then cuts back on planned maintenance during the winter months in order to make more of its fleet available for the higher load in winter. But even with that reduced planned maintenance over winter, I expect this winter to be a very tough one with regard to load shedding. And the reason is Eskom can't actually tell us. And I think this morning Andre de Ruyter said it's all about probabilities. And the probabilities aren't looking good. I wouldn't put money on no load shedding this winter, and it's going to be severe, I'm afraid. And then to top it all, we've got one of the units at Coburg out of commission at the moment. And so at any point on time, if we have any stage of load shedding, one of those stages is directly due to the fact that Coburg's not available.
Sure, there's so much to look at there. You've got a suggestion you're punting at the moment. It's a public-private agreement that would involve district municipalities and financing from the Treasury, and they would essentially fund their own generating capacity, if I've understood it correctly, through renewable energy.
Yeah,
in your own words, what do you propose?
Yeah, Stephen, let's maybe look at it in the context of Johannesburg. We're sitting in Johannesburg at the moment. What can the people of Johannesburg do to stop load shedding in Johannesburg? So the answer is that we need to do a whole lot of things in parallel. The state procurement through the risk mitigation program and through the IPP office isn't sufficient. So the municipalities and the district municipalities need to flex their buying power in order to enable new installations to be built. So people within the city of Johannesburg, businesses and people alike, could put funds in through some kind of bond issuance to build utility-scale wind and solar plants that would supply electricity to City Power. And City Power then would vend that electricity back to the participants. The key thing here, though, is that the owners of those plants would essentially be the people who own the green bonds. The job of the people who looked after the plants, the so-called equity owners, their job would be to make damn sure that these plants work, both to supply electricity to Johannesburg, as well as to supply dividends to the people who had subscribed to those bonds.
Okay, so, I mean, it's a sort of clever financial solution in a way. So it wouldn't be owned by the city of Joburg, it wouldn't be owned by national government either? Ideally, in my opinion, it should be owned by the city of Joburg, but with that ownership would come the responsibility. The ownership would vest itself in the responsibility of the city of Joburg to make sure that those plants work properly and that they paid the plants timeously from the city of Johannesburg, who was purchasing from those plants. But the core cash flows that those plants were generating would go to service dividends on the bonds for the people who owned the debt of those plants. So I'm advocating that businesses and people in Johannesburg own the debt of those plants, but it's what I call good debt. If you borrow money to invest in a flat that you rent out to pay off your bond, that's good debt. If you borrow money to invest in a solar plant that delivers electricity to your business in Johannesburg, that's good debt, not bad debt. So that's the intention. So because you owned a bond, you would be guaranteed supply from the solar plant? No, the city would get supply, but the more that this was done, and in fact the city of Johannesburg, if they did this to its full extent, they could supplant 80% of their power from wind and solar. In other words, only have to still get 20% from Eskom. And guess what the city would save, give or take? A fortune. 4 billion rand a year, sure, the city would save. So they would be going and buying wholesale product at a 4 billion rand a year discount. And then whatever happens inside the city, net metering, rooftop and everything could happen on top of that. We're just talking about core, raw, bulk supply of electricity. And the idea is that the greenness of that electricity would go to businesses who need green, and the cheapness of that electricity would go to the poor who can't afford electricity. So you would split the dividends in terms of the benefits.
So it would stop denetworkification where the rich just produce a power plant for themselves.
Exactly. Instead of spending money to put a power plant on your roof, you would spend money to invest in a power plant that would supply electricity to all the citizens of Johannesburg. Soweto, Diepsloot, you name it. Everyone would get, and the poor would tend to get cheaper electricity, and the businesses, particularly those that were sensitive to their carbon footprint, would get the green part of that electricity at perhaps the same price they're currently paying for anyway. But the point is they would get it. There would be no load shedding. The problem with this is we've waited too long. We've got ourselves into a situation now where load shedding is there. So this isn't a flick your finger kind of solution, but it's doable inside of 24 months.
Okay, so I mean, this would then mean that Eskom would still exist. You would still have a national grid.
Absolutely. Eskom would absolutely exist, and Eskom would in fact still be providing the grid, because the connection of those utility scale wind and solar plants that I'm talking about would connect to the Eskom grid. Eskom's job would start translating then into be a delivery organization as opposed to a manufacturing organization. But Eskom could also have part ownership of those utility plants. I don't really care who owns them.
Yes.
With that ownership comes the responsibility of securitizing them, making sure they run properly, making sure the grid is there to accept what they have to offer, and making sure that they pay dividends to the people who funded them. And then if that's done well, there'll be a bonus in it, as it were, for Eskom/City Power, whoever owns the responsibility.
Wow, since Eskom paid out bonuses. So as I understand it, okay, I mean, in a way it's a sort of an attractive proposition.
Yes.
What I'm not quite sure of, and maybe I haven't understood it correctly, is that at the moment, say, the city of Cape Town or the city of Ekurhuleni both want to buy power from independent power producers.
Yes.
So what that would mean is that, some filthy capitalist would come along, would have to put up their own capital, so they'll put up their own money to build a solar power plant, say, in the Northern Cape, and then they have to get that electricity, let's just use the example of Cape Town for convenience sake, and get that electricity to Cape Town. The city of Cape Town pays them, right?
Yes.
Now, that means that that's their capital at risk, not people not residents, not businesses who've had to buy into what you're proposing. What's the advantage of what you're proposing compared to what's actually happening at the moment?
The advantage of what I'm proposing is that the municipalities wouldn't lose their income streams. At the moment, municipalities are quite worried about losing the source of their clients. So not only would municipalities be buying from IPPs, but in many cases they're looking at ways of wheeling that electricity through to businesses. So they would buy the electricity from the IPP or receive it and then wheel it across their grid to Old Mutual or someone.
But that's what they're doing at the
moment.
And
they would lose Old Mutual as a customer then. My model says you buying wholesale, you're still selling to the Old Mutual or whoever it happens to be, but the dividends are like pension funds are flowing to the people of the city of Cape Town. So everyone wins. There's no filthy capitalists. The filthy capitalists are the citizens of Cape Town who have subscribed to the green bond. And the idea is that banks lend those who don't have money to subscribe against their housing property. They give them long-term housing bonds. They can then use that to subscribe. And if we're going to give anyone lowest interest rate bonds, it should be the poorest of the people rather than the richest. So instead of the rich getting prime -3, the poor get prime -3. They invested in a green bond, and everyone then can drive past that solar farm and kind of say, you see those panels in row 3 there, they belong to me. And I'm helping stopping load shedding for the country. That's the basic idea. And in parallel for all of the district municipalities in the metros.
Yeah.
So perhaps the biggest problem with your idea is not the feasibility. I think it must be feasible.
Yes.
It's not the fact that it, in a way, distributes and perhaps redistributes a little bit of wealth, also very important. Moy is quite keen on removing filthy capitalists where possible.
Yes.
The biggest problem may, in fact, be that the country has chosen to go in a different direction, that you might find it very difficult to lobby people to change direction now.
The biggest problem is that it involves the democratization of energy, and the incumbents want to do the exact opposite. They want to control and dominate energy. And so we've always had a centralized energy, whether it be coal or nuclear, whether it be gas in future, and these very lucrative income streams that come from supplying the necessary fossil fuels to keep either coal or gas or nuclear running. And this way, you're losing your grip on a potential pipeline of funds into whoever gets those funds, whether it's royalties for government, whether it's, I don't want to go there, I'm staying on top of the table, not under the table. But that's actually the problem. And there's also a lot of incumbents who have made big investments into coal. They've borrowed a lot of money. And we're not talking with this model of shutting down coal. This is to augment what we're getting from the coal. And it's also, it's a term Andre de Ruyter uses a lot now, and I like to think he poached it from me. We create the headroom with new energy to allow us to retire the coal fleet with dignity, instead of scrambling around with a makeshift funeral. That's really the idea.
Clyde Mallinson, thank you very much for coming in. It's worthy of a lot of consideration, your proposal, the energy analyst Clyde Mallinson.